Hi, everyone. Let's talk about culturally responsive teaching during these very challenging times that we're entering. And make no mistake, these times are challenging. Whether we're talking about the pandemic, that is not new, but it's not over either. We're talking about lost time in school. We're talking about online instruction and the challenges that go with online instruction, as well as making connections. Or we're talking about injustices and racism that are out there and inequities that are out there. These days are very challenging. Now, let me bottom line it for you. Some of what I'm talking about also gets into the area of trauma informed instruction. The key thing with trauma informed instruction is sensitivity, getting to know the student, responding appropriately, and drawing on resources, including school resources and expert resources as needed. Don't think that you need to go it alone. Now, when it comes to being culturally responsive, here are some bottom line do's and don'ts before we get into the presentation. Do be caring. Do build a relationship with your students. Do set a positive community of learners in your classroom in which there's a common sense of understanding of here are the goals that we operate by, here's what we're trying to learn, here are the expectations, here are ways in which we're going to help each other learn, in which I can learn from you, you can learn from me. Here are ways in which we're going to value each other and respect each other, and each of our cultures and backgrounds and individualities are to be respected. Those are things you can do. Some things you want to avoid, don't be fake, be real. And because trust me, students will see through it. If you're trying to quote a bunch of song lyrics from a genre of music that you don't know or don't understand, students will see through that, and they may pretend that they think you're cool, but in reality, you're not connecting. Be real. Students need you to be authentic. They don't need you to be fake. Don't engage in tokenism. What I mean by tokenism, for instance, is hanging a poster of Martin Luther King up on the wall and thinking now you've covered Black history. No, that's tokenism. Hanging a poster of Jackie Chan and thinking now you respect Asian culture. No, that's tokenism. Don't do it. You need to be real, you need to go deeper. If you've got books in your classroom, for instance, a classroom library, I strongly recommend a wide variety of diverse books representing the diverse cultures in your classroom and ethnicities in your classroom and backgrounds in your classroom. Allow students to see each other as represented. Don't have monolithic books in your classroom that are difficult to read and boring. And whatever you do, please don't engage in stereotypes. Even if it's the so-called helpful stereotypes, the so-called positive stereotypes, which are not so positive, like the model minority myth about Asians. Don't do that, because that model minority myth is actually harmful in so many ways. For instance, an Asian student who may very well be good at math might be dealing with the model minority myth in which certain assumptions are being made. Oh, you're an Asian, so you're good at math. Well, that's downplaying the amount of work that it takes to be good at math. And there are so many things that go along with the model minority myth. Don't do it, please. And we'll go on with further do's and don'ts as we go into this discussion. A little bit about me, because I believe the background is important, especially on a topic like this. I'm currently an assistant professor in the School of Education at University of Arkansas at Little Rock, where I specialize especially in English language arts as well as literacy instruction. Primarily 6 through 12, although I do teach and work in the area of K through 12 as well. I'm formerly an assistant professor of education with Harris Stowe State University here at BTAP, Beginning Teachers Assistant Program. That's, of course, why I'm so active in BTAP. I'm formerly a high school English teacher in Central Florida, as well as reading teacher and reading specialist in Central Florida. Those were high schools. in Central Florida, and my PhD is from Clemson University. Here's the bottom line of what that means. I've taught in a wide variety of locations and places and diverse students. Little Rock, Arkansas is urban, mid-size. St. Louis is a little bigger than Little Rock. It's also urban and relatively mid-size within the Midwest. I've taught at a wide variety of types of schools. UALR is a PWI, predominantly white institution. In Little Rock, it's a public institution in the University of Arkansas system, although it's fairly diverse. Harris-Stowe State University, of course, as most of you know, is an HBCU. In Central Florida, I taught at Seminole High School in Sanford, Florida, which is highly diverse. And I also taught at a high school in East Orlando, which was highly diverse. The majority of students were Latino. The majority of students, their first language was Spanish. And of course, I did some teaching while I was at Clemson University, which is, of course, relatively rural South Carolina. So you can see diversity. I encourage you guys as you go through your career, even as you're entering your teaching careers, visit various schools, get to know various teachers, expose the experiences that you are gaining to diverse backgrounds, because you will gain from a diversity of experiences and from learning from a diverse group of students. I know I have. Okay, a little bit about culturally responsive instruction. A little bit of background on what I'm drawing from. I'm drawing here from the work of people like Geneva Gay, obviously James Banks, Gloria Ladson-Billings. I strongly recommend you consider this book, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies, Django Paris. I'm drawing on, and I also like the work of Carol Lee in this area, retired out of Northwestern, and I recommend you look into the work of, if you're into English language arts and literacy, look into the work of Valerie Kinloch out of University of Pittsburgh. Has done some interesting work in this area. Pedro Noguera is also excellent in this area, and there are others. Okay, so here are some keys. Be nurturing and supportive. That doesn't mean soft on your expectations. You can be nurturing and also be firm, fair, and have high expectations of your students too. That means set up a classroom atmosphere, a classroom climate in which students feel valued, students feel like they have a sense of belonging, they are respected, and the competence that they bring from home, including linguistic competence, is valued and it is respected. Recognize the importance of bringing in a student's backgrounds. When I talk about cultural references, I talk about their linguistic cues. I'm talking about their backgrounds from home, their histories that they bring with them, their knowledge. And sometimes you can have students do a type of shared teaching, co-teaching activities with a class in which you might have students teach the class about a topic and bring in a little bit about their backgrounds or cultural backgrounds and make it a little bit more meaningful to the entire class. That allows students to feel valued. Dialogue matters. This includes things like interest inventories or conferences, one-on-one conferences that you might have. For instance, when you're doing a writing workshop, if you have a chance to get into a conference with a student as part of a writing workshop, you can also use that as an opportunity to get to know the student a little bit better too. So, very important, respect. Respect and value the knowledge as well as the experiences that students bring with them, and respect them as individuals. Try to connect as much as possible the academic content that you teach to the lived experiences and the real life interests of your students. That way your material, whether it is math, science, social studies, English, whatever, becomes that much more meaningful to the students. You can do that by little reference points. You can do that by visuals. You can do that by saying, okay, here's how a piece of history that we're learning connects to real life events. You can do that with, for instance, what's called problem-based learning, where students will investigate a problem that exists using what amounts to the scientific method of investigation, and they'll come up with proposed solutions to address that problem. And in the process, that very much connects to the students' investigation. Inquiry-based learning provides you with a really good avenue for being culturally responsive. You want to be asset-based and not deficit-based in your instruction. The difference is, for instance, let's take the example of a student whose first language is Spanish. The deficit model is to say a bunch of negative stereotyped things about people who speak Spanish as their home language, and you don't draw upon that as any kind of strength whatsoever. You don't see any kind of asset to speaking Spanish, and so the students don't feel welcome, and maybe the students may in a nightmare scenario may feel like they are just kind of ignored and left alone in the classroom, and the teacher teaches everything in English, and the students are completely ignored, and there's no resources, no help, and that's where things go terribly wrong. That's deficit-based instruction. You want to be asset-based. The books you choose might help the student use Spanish as a bridge to also learn English, for instance, because if you're talking about learning English, there are common roots and common histories between the languages, Spanish and English, where Spanish can be a very valuable bridge to learning English, for instance. Or you might draw upon culture, linguistic cues, in which, again, the student might take time to teach the class or work in groups and use that as a strength. Draw upon the funds of knowledge that exist. Here I'm drawing on citing Louis Mull here, as well as Carol Lee. Draw upon that student's funds of knowledge as an asset to help other students learn and to help that own student learn the academic content. So it's very important to value the idea of children learning about themselves as well as the world around them in the context of their own lived cultural experiences. Don't ignore whatever the culture is that the student comes from. Don't ignore that as a source of strength, and allow that student to feel like his or her culture is valuable and valued. Watch out for times when a student might feel like his or her culture needs to be pushed aside or devalued or ignored. This especially happens in the case of immigrant children. First and second generation immigrant children might feel like their language and home culture is second best compared to the majority culture, and might feel like it's unvalued and unwelcome. And this can cause sources of trauma to that student. So again, you want to value cultural knowledge, value prior experiences, and value varied ways of performing, be it kinesthetic, linguistic, verbal, visual, because here's the thing, and I want to be very clear about something between performance styles and learning styles. When we talk about a student who might be more comfortable and more skilled at, let's say, kinesthetic learning or visual linguistic learning or other forms of learning styles, obviously, if a student from, let's say, kindergarten through 8th grade has had the majority of successful school experiences be rooted to kinesthetic and might be athletic, that student is going to have more confidence, more self-efficacy with kinesthetic learning experiences. So if you ask that student, what's your learning style? That student is going to say, I'm a kinesthetic learner, because that's where that student has higher self-efficacy, higher confidence to do a particular task with success. That does not mean, and I want to be very clear about something, that does not mean that you should ignore the other performance styles, the visual, linguistic, and so forth. Children need these other ways of meaning making, not just one. You don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that you have identified a particular student learns so-called best a certain way, so you want to center everything on that one performance style and ignore the others. No, make sure the students get varied opportunities. For instance, uh, if a student has a chance to learn about a concept visually and concentrate, focus on visually, and then also read as well about that concept, then perform about that concept, let's say in drama or in readers' theater type of activities, then these varied ways of performing out that concept and making meaning of that concept and communicating about that concept will help that student learn that concept and develop skills in deeper and richer, more transferable ways. So it's very important. Paulo Freire wrote a lot about this in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and others have too. It's very important to draw upon varied ways of learning and varied ways of performing in the classroom. And bottom line here is you want to teach to and through strengths of your diverse students. Don't just assume that there are no strengths. So, key thing here is culturally responsive teaching acknowledges that the cultural heritage of your diverse students are legitimate, they're valuable, they're rich, they're worthy. You want to build a bridge between home and school. If you were to read the work of Elizabeth Bermoji, for instance, in the reading and English language arts field, she talks about an approach called third space. In a nutshell, third space is that the teacher's academic knowledge, academic content, and prior knowledge, that's one space, if you will, and the teacher's trying to teach this academic content. The students' home history, home knowledge, background knowledge is a type of second space. But there's a gap in between there. And if we don't bridge that gap, then there's going to be a lack of learning. So the third space is this bridge that's built between the student's background and the teacher's background. Shared experiences, shared communication, care, connections that are built, ways in which the student can draw upon background knowledge to inform the way that that student is learning a new concept. That's the third space that's created. And I want you to think about ways of building that bridge between the student and yourself. Use a wide variety of instructional strategies. I just talked about inquiry-based learning and problem-based learning, but that's not to say that direct instruction is never to be used. Of course, there are times when explicit and direct instruction is absolutely the most valuable way that you can teach a concept or a skill. The thing is that there is no single best strategy for all times. This instructional strategy that is most important and best to use depends on context, depends on situation. I'm a fan of problem-based learning, but problem-based learning isn't appropriate always. Depends on situation. Know the student, know the situation, know the context, and know your learning goals. Your strategies should meet your learning goals. So you want to integrate diverse knowing, diverse understanding, and diverse ways in which students represent information. Remember the various language arts, reading, writing, visual representation. You want to make diverse use of all of this in the classroom. Don't just limit yourself. So with English language learners, very important, allow the English language learners in your classroom to feel welcomed. to feel like their experience is worthwhile. For instance, if you're teaching online, you might use the screen with subtitles for your students. If you are teaching books, you might draw upon multiple books, including allow that student to use dictionaries and cues and tips from the first language to help that student learn the second language. There's nothing wrong with a dictionary, with a Spanish to English dictionary and so forth. There's nothing wrong with the student, if that student has a smartphone, being able to look up things on the smartphone for help. Nothing wrong with that. You want to use resources to help the students. Allow the student to contribute to conversations, even if it might be mixed between one language and the other. For instance, code meshing. Code meshing is okay. The important thing is that you want your students to be learning. You want your students to be growing. Build relationships and mutual trust among your students. You want your curriculum to incorporate the social situations, the lived experiences of your students in rich ways that help them also meet high expectations and learning standards and learning goals for your content area. Something that is sometimes a mistake that I've seen young teachers make, student teachers make when I'm a college teacher, and I've even seen experienced teachers make this, is they'll think that culturally responsive teaching is something that's done separate from the academic curriculum. And so I'm aware of situations where, for instance, a science teacher might take time away from the science content to read a book that might draw upon cultural diversity, but have, frankly, nothing necessarily to do with science, and the teacher isn't able to help students and help parents see the bridge between the science content and this book that's being read. And the next thing that happens is parents and even students might complain about, hey, why are we spending so much time on this particular book that has nothing to do with science when this is supposed to be a science class? Don't make that mistake. Integrate culturally responsive instruction into your academic curriculum in meaningful and rich ways. This is not an approach that is meant to take away from your academic content, quite the opposite. It is meant to add to integratively your academic content so that students learn your academic content, your science, your math, in deeper, richer, more meaningful ways. Make sure that your curriculum remains intellectually stimulating. Notice I didn't use the term rigorous. I prefer the term vigorous rather than rigorous, because rigor has a tendency, if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll see vigor also means stiff, unmoving. I want a curriculum that's alive, that's stimulating, that's lively, that fires up a student's imagination, not brings the student into rigor mortis. So your instruction should be meaningful. It should include issues that help the students connect, and it should challenge the students to use, and you're aware of the higher order thinking skills, the application, the analysis, the creation, the synthesis. Allow students to use higher order knowledge and higher order skills in diverse ways. So again, please don't think that when we talk about culturally responsive teaching, we're doing it as something that's separate from your academic curriculum. What we're really talking about is just good teaching that will help your students learn. So as we move forward, here are some bottom lines for what I mean by culturally responsive teaching. It recognizes that a student's cultural background is central to learning because it's part of background knowledge, right? It's part of the student's schema that the student draws upon to make connections with new learning. It can empower students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and yes, politically. Now, obviously, as a teacher, you don't need to get up there and make political stances about who you vote for. But let's face it, your students, especially if you're teaching 6 through 12, they've got things on their minds. I can pretty much guarantee it. Now, some of them may agree or disagree with various stances, and they may not always agree with each other politically, but especially if you're teaching high school, the students have things on your mind. It's okay to explore. Especially in problem-based learning where you're exploring controversial topics. It's okay, just do it smartly. So you want to respect, recognize, and draw upon the identities and backgrounds of your students in ways that are meaningful to the academic content. So from there, make sure that your teaching is validating to the student's background, personal identity, as well as cultural identity and ethnicity. Make sure that it is comprehensive, meaning it is integrative. Remember what I said about don't do tokenism. Don't think that you need to separate the culturally responsive part from the academic part. Tie it in there, make it meaningful. Make sure that students know, okay, fine, this teacher is being culturally responsive, but in a way that also helps us learn science or helps us learn math in deeper, richer, meaningful ways, multidimensionally. Remember what we've been talking about, multiple ways of meaning making, visual, linguistic, kinesthetic, artistic, the drama, for instance, the problem-based learning, all of this can help the student be creative. It takes careful planning. When we talk about empowering and emancipatory, think of it this way. I am somebody. Allow that student to say, I am somebody. I matter. And if you've got enough courage, here are ways in which society can change and grow and improve. Here's what we can do about it. Let's explore some issues that exist and let's transform our lives, our lived experiences, our society in ways that are more just, more kind, more loving. And so you want to sustain culture as well as sustain lived experiences. And that's bottom line of what we mean by culturally sustaining pedagogy. You've got 4 R's that I want to really make sure that you focus upon in this approach. Respect your students. And yes, your students should respect you too, but it shouldn't be respect that's based upon pure fear. I am the dictator. It should be respect. I admire this teacher. I've gained so much from this teacher. This teacher cares about me. Reciprocity. Be giving. Be kind. And hope for kindness back. You can be learning from your students the same way your students can be learning from you. That's part of reciprocity. Responsibility. And this goes along with care. You have a responsibility as a teacher to ensure that your students have learning opportunities, excellent learning opportunities, to ensure that students have opportunities to develop their skills, to develop their cognitive abilities, to develop their intellectual capabilities, to make sure that students have opportunities to succeed in life, to grow, to explore. This also includes responsibility to respect your students, to treat your students with care. In education circles, there's something called a contract to care that we often talk about. The contract to care basically is as follows. If you demonstrate in the sort of contractual relationship that exists between you and the students that you very genuinely, very authentically care about the students' needs, interests, capabilities, and yes, culture, then even students who might enter the classroom resistant, having had difficult experiences, are more likely to start caring and more likely to give the academic content a chance. On the other hand, if you violate that contract, if you show that you really don't care about that student's background, capabilities, interests, needs, then even students who might have entered the classroom wanting to learn, wanting to be engaged, will kind of tune out. At most, they might kind of do just enough to earn a grade, at most. Some students will stop even doing that if you violate that contract to care. So again, those are the 4 R's. Teach with these 4 R's in mind, and you're very much well on your way to doing good, solid, culturally responsive teaching. So remember what we often talk about as the Pygmalion effect. Remember that our actions toward others impact the way that others have certain beliefs about us. And in turn, these beliefs that others have about us cause others toward acting, treating us in a certain manner, positively or negatively. This in turn reinforces our beliefs about ourselves, and our beliefs about ourselves will influence our actions. This creates a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. So what that also means is that the teachers will sometimes have expectations for students that might have nothing to do with the student's actual ability. And sometimes this can have a kind of confining effect on curriculum. So be careful about that Pygmalion effect too. And also remember that Pygmalion effect works toward you as a teacher too. Your actions will impact the beliefs that your students have about you, whether you care, for instance. There's also a concept called the invisible child syndrome. Be very careful about this. The invisible child syndrome is when a child needs to hear or see himself positively in the curriculum, and oftentimes the child does not see positive representations of, for instance, Black children or Asian children in the curriculum. And so therefore, there's this kind of invisibility. Be careful. That's why diverse representation in your books and in your curriculum is very, very important. And in your conversation is very important. Cultural competence. Bottom line of what cultural competence means is that your ability to understand the cultural and historical background of your student will help you be better equipped to also react positively and responsibly toward your students in diverse settings and in diverse situations. It's very important to develop this cultural competency. And it doesn't just, if you're struggling with your students, let's say hypothetically, you might be uncomfortable when it comes to cultural competency. That's okay to admit, but working on it through various experiences and listening and growing. Expectations. Remember, expectations should be high. You still should communicate clear learning goals and behavior goals and clear expectations. Be very specific about what you expect students to know and be able to do in your academic content. That also goes along with consistency, respect, care. Nothing will tell a student inherently that the teacher doesn't care any more clearly than a teacher who's unclear and giving unfair what the student thinks of as unfair grades. That's a good way to violate that contract of care. So you want to create an environment in which there is very genuine respect for the students as well as respect and valuing of that student's capability. Remember, praise when standards are met, but not just simply empty praise, the praise that is very specific to what that student has done. Be aware of what's called the hidden curriculum. These are these hidden messages, these hidden signals that a student's doing. For instance, if a teacher is constantly giving out lavish praise for the simplest of tasks for the student, that's going to make the student feel like, okay, you really think I'm dumb, don't you? If you're constantly offering help, even when it's not wanted or needed, that again is going to communicate the wrong thing to that student. If that student never sees any representations of his or her culture and background in the curriculum or the books that you choose and so forth, that's going to send certain invisibility factors to the student. So be very careful about these hidden messages that you're sending to the students because those messages matter. Dialogue with your students. This is very important. Build a bridge between yourself and your students. Conversation, dialogue, conferences. For instance, when you're having a writing conference with writing workshop activities, if you pull the student in to talk about pre-writing or revising or teaching grammar in meaningful context, these are also opportunities to get to know that student a little bit better. You want to focus on ways that students learn. Share responsibility for instruction, the co-teaching strategies that I was just talking about, the cooperative learning, for instance, that I was talking about, building that bridge, learning from one another. Allow students to occasionally lead discussion groups, have inquiry-based instruction. This all will help you to be culturally responsive. And like I was just simply saying, avoid the deficit model. I cannot stress that enough. The deficit model is basically looking at a student fails in school because his culture or background is inherently lacking, and without looking at the structural or other difficulties that the student has dealt with. A deficit perspective basically blames the victim. And it poisons your teaching. It poisons the learning interactions that you engage in. So please be very careful about that deficit model. So, for instance, sometimes classroom teachers will underestimate the cognitive ability of children who are growing up in poverty. And that's not good. That's called the deficit model. That shows negative biases, negative stereotypes. Like I was saying, make sure that you're integrating your culturally responsive instruction in very meaningful ways into your curriculum, ways that are goal oriented, and in ways in which very meaningfully help students explore skills, develop their skills. There are different approaches to curriculum. You've got your explicit curriculum, which you need to keep in mind. When you make your lesson plans, your curriculum design that's written down, that's an example of your explicit curriculum. The text that you purposefully choose, the teaching materials that you purposefully choose ahead of time in advance, that's all your explicit curriculum. So as you're preparing your explicit curriculum, think about ways of being culturally responsive based upon everything we've just been talking about. From there, you've also got your enacted curriculum. Your enacted curriculum is informed by your explicit curriculum. This is your lesson plans, your unit plans as they are actually taught. But sometimes there can also be differences. You might plan your curriculum to go in a certain way, but you might teach it in an entirely different way. Your enacted curriculum deals with what the students actually experience. So maybe you planned your curriculum to be culturally responsive, but you didn't have much follow through. And so therefore the students still feel stereotyped. That's a problem. You've also got your null curriculum that I want you to think about. Your null curriculum is basically material that is not taught in school, the stuff that's being left out. For instance, if you never have any books that are representative of diverse cultures, diverse groups, then that creates a sort of null curriculum. It sends a message to the students about which groups, which peoples, which skin color matters within the curriculum and is valued within the curriculum and which one doesn't. That null curriculum is very sneaky because oftentimes, to be very honest, the teacher might not be explicitly thinking about the null curriculum, but it's there. And the students pick up on it. Think, as I was just simply saying, about your hidden curriculum. These are the norms, the values that are implied within the way in which you teach, your positive or negative messages, your stereotypes that you might be communicating. Think very carefully about that hidden curriculum, because that hidden curriculum, even if your explicit curriculum and your enacted curriculum might meet high standards, and it might mean learning goals, and it might be teaching according to the state standards, if you've got a poisonous hidden curriculum, then your students will become less engaged and they'll learn less, even if your lesson plans were solid. Your actions matter. I want you to think about ways in which you can do the following 5 steps as a teacher. Build trust with your students. Engage in a personal culture of growth with your students. Address issues of privilege. Help your students engage in transforming practices. And engage the entire school community. When we talk about building trust, engagement, communication is critical to trust building. Remember that contract to care. So as you go throughout the rest of this year, I want you to think about, put down in writing steps that you can really take toward building trust on your own. Then we talk about engagement. You need to build your cultural competence. That's your ability to engage in communication and understanding in ways that's effective. So it's very important for your students to feel a sense of belonging in your classroom. They need to have a sense of trust in you as well as their classmates. There needs to be a belief among your students that you as a teacher actually values their competence, their needs, their interests, their performance. So what I want you to do is put down in writing on your own later concrete steps that you can take to positively impact student motivation and performance in ways that are culturally responsive. From there, confronting privilege. Systems in which certain groups in society might feel excluded or devalued or having a lack of voice. And so think on your own about ways in which your school can take steps toward showing evidence of being equitable toward various groups. And your strategy that I want you to take on your own is, as a teacher, how can you take concrete steps toward making sure that students do feel included and not excluded. From there, we talk about transformative practices. You want your instructional strategies to meet the diverse needs of your students in ways that help the students feel empowered to lead lives that are powerful, that are meaningful, and might lead toward more equitable social change in society, even if it's one person at a time. So as a teacher, how can you make your instructional practices ones that are transformative for your students and allow your students to feel empowered? Okay, so thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this. Feel free to email me anytime. Have a good day.